The movie begins with Mr. Snow in an enclosed meeting with a man called Mr. Straker, who instructed him to retrieve a crucial item for him. Mr. Straker told Snow to take his truck to the wharf at 6 o'clock in the evening to receive a large crate for him. He further emphasized how important the crate is, then told him to deliver it to the Marsten House, which is his new home. A few moments later, Mr. Snow and his friend Hank got to the house where they were supposed to deliver the crate. They jointly lifted the crate and carried it into the cellar, as it was the instructions of Mr. Straker. However, on getting down there, the cellar was too dark and the crate was too heavy, so Hank mistakenly stumbled on a wood, which made him drop the crate and it broke. Immediately, Snow turned the lights on, and they discover the crate was packed with dirt. They are shocked by this discovery, but ignored it and continued moving the crate. They finally dropped off the crate and was about to leave, but Snow started hearing a voice that was calling out to him to come closer, but Hank talked him out of it, and they both left. Meanwhile, Ben Mears was watching from a distance at the Marsten House. Then a police officer startled him and asked what he was doing there, and he told him that he used to live the place and not to cause trouble, before the officer then left. Soon after, Ben left to visit a real estate company to look for a place to rent, and that was when he met a lady called Susan, who was reading his book, and she developed a liking towards him. He made inquiries about the Marsten House because he saw someone there while he was sightseeing. Then she told him that it's an European fella that bought the house of recent, and his shop is just right across the street. That same day, Ben was introduced to his new home by an aged lady. She told him everything he needed to know about the place. The scene then shifted to Ralph, Danny, and Mark trying to do a magic trick, but then Richie Bodden, who happens to be a bully, walked towards them. Richie punched Mark so hard in the face that he fell, but Mark wasn't having all of that, so he pinned Richie to the ground and wouldn't let him go till Mr. Burke separated them, and after giving him a word of advice, they all dispersed. The children went their separate way, but Mr. Straker was observing them closely from his shop. Ben is in the library researching on homicides that happened in Salem's lot. Then Susan walked in with her mother, pestering her to marry the man she found for him. Susan looked back and she saw that Ben was also in the library too. Susan and her mother get informed about who Ben was by the receptionist, as she remembered him vividly as 20 years ago at Hallowell Road. There was an awful crash which they people who had died in the accident was his both parents. However, Susan so stylishly told him to meet her at the drive-in tonight. The children arrived at Mark's home, and it was filled with scary stuffs. Ralph then suggested they head home, as it's almost getting dark, and Ralph is scared of the dark. Mark then gave him a Houdini to blow on when he's scared, so it'll help stabilize his breathing. Fortunately for Susan, Ben arrived at the drive-in where he met Susan. Danny and Ralph were on their way home, but then Mr. Straker proceeded towards them in his car. He greeted them and further offered them a ride, but they declined his request and took a route through the forest to evade him. Susan was sitting with Mark on an anchor watching all the cars from above. He then asked her about her story, which she told him. It was a sad one, and he sympathized with her. She then asked him why he came back to Salem's lot, and he told her that he's here just for research. Meanwhile, Danny and Ralph were still on their way home, but then they heard a sound from the back, but they ignored it and kept on moving. All of a sudden, Mr. Straker from earlier kidnapped Ralph and put him in the trunk of his car. He dragged him into the Marsten House so he could sacrifice him to his master Barlow, the Lord of Flies. All the candles that were lit went off, then Master Barlow came outside to receive his sacrifice, thereby devouring Ralph in cold blood. 1 week later, the search party that went looking for Ralph came back, but still no information about his whereabouts. Ben brought Susan home after the search, and her mom was watching from upstairs. Danny was in his room blaming himself for Ralph, who went missing. Then he started hearing someone playing the Houdini that Mark gave to Ralph. Danny looked through his window to see if it was Ralph, but everywhere was covered in fog, so he went outside to have a closer view. Danny tried to trace where the sound was coming from. Then he saw the Houdini on the floor, but something was also creeping at his back. He turned around and walked in that direction, but then something grabbed him from above. The next day, Danny was taken to the hospital by his mom, and they diagnosed him with pernicious anemia, a condition where your body can't make blood fast enough. Danny woke up in the night and told his mom that he's thirsty, so she rushed out to call the nurse to get him some water. But when she came back, he was already drinking the blood being transfused to him, and she screamed in agony. The next day, the whole town gathered together for Danny's burial, and Ben was also there. The undertaker fell asleep at the event, but he woke up later that night and proceeded to bury Danny's coffin. He was laying sands at the ground. As he did so, he began hearing bangings from inside the coffin begging him for help. He was shocked, and he ended up opening the coffin and saw Mark laying there lifeless, so he closed it back and proceeded with a burial, not knowing Mark was already outside. He wanted to continue the burial, but he met the coffin open. Danny then came from his back and fed on him. Mr. Burke, after teaching in school, went to a bar to clear his head. Then he saw the undertaker from the funeral and approached him. Burke noticed he wasn't looking so good, so he asked him, but the problem was, and he told him that he hasn't been feeling well since after the funeral, and he's scared to go home. So Burke invited him to stay with him for the night. Burke saw bite marks on his neck and asked him how he got those scars, but immediately he saw the blood. It aroused something in him. Mr. Burke was taking his pipe downstairs, then he heard a knock on his front door. He went out to check who was knocking, but he saw the person climbing onto his window. Mr. Burke went immediately to meet Ben at his home. He asked Ben for a cross of any kind or a medallion of some sort, after which he insisted they follow him to his house. He then took them to the room where he kept the undertaker, and he discovered that his body is now cold and the marks on his neck aren't there any longer. They were all sophisticated and felt he was a vampire, so they called a constable from the police department to check on him. That night, Mark was in his room, fast asleep. Then he started hearing sounds from the window, and when he looked, he saw it was Danny. Mark put on his glasses and saw Danny pleading to let him in, so he proceeded slowly to the window, and when he made eye contact with Danny, Danny used mind compulsion to get him to open the window, as he was reluctant to open it at first. Danny flew into the window and told Mark that Master Barlow wants to meet him, but then the cross on his desk glowed up, and he immediately placed it on Danny's chin, which made flee. Mark then rushed to close the window back and vowed to set Danny free. He instantly brought out his books and started researching about vampires. He then marked out some keywords and came to a conclusion that he has to kill Barlow for Danny to be free. Burke was doing his own fair share of research about vampires so he could be prepared, but unfortunately for him, when he turned back, he saw the Undertaker already transformed to a vampire, so he used the cross on his table to rebuke him. He paraded the cross around his house and to make sure the demonic vampire was gone, but he was attacked from behind and his cross was far-fetched. The vampire advanced towards him slowly, but he was able to reach for his cross and finally rebuke him out of his house. The next day, a nurse came to tell the doctor that treated Danny, informing her fellow nurse that his mom was found dead this morning. She then remembered what Burke told her about vampires, so she rushed to the morgue to check if the Undertaker's body is still there, but it was gone. The doctor headed over to Burke's house and saw the whole place is messed up, and he was busted pretty bad. She told him about the death and the missing corpse from the morgue, and asked him if he had any idea what was going on. As she treated him, he told her all the deterrents for vampires, but she assumed it was all some made-up superstition. Meanwhile, Mark arrived with a stick in his hand to the Marsten House. He first of all opened the cellar and walked right in. He looked around looking for Barlow, but Burke was in there also and asked him out. Mark told him that Barlow is a vampire and he got Danny, but as they were discussing, Straker locked them inside. Burke lit up the candles as it was very dark inside there. Then he held Mark closely as they tried to find another way out. Burke carried Mike upstairs, but it was too late. Straker opened the door and carried Mark, while Barlow fed on Burke. At night, Ben was with Susan and the doctor at the morgue, monitoring Mark's mother's dead body closely to see if there'll be any reaction. All of a sudden, her body started moving, and they were all terrified. So they took chopsticks and made it into a cross so they can use it to rebuke the vampire. They started praying and the cross began glowing, but suddenly the cross broke and the vampire jumped on the doctor and eventually bit her. Susan put the cross back together and placed it on the vampire's back, which caused her to flee. After the vampire had been reprimanded, they discovered she had been bitten, so they gave her a rabies shot so it could stop the bite from spreading. They then decided to go to the church authorities the next day to acquire holy items. Mark was hung upside down at the Marsten House, and as he was struggling to free himself, he fell down. Straker walked into the loving room. Mark then knocked him out from behind and killed him. Ben, Susan, and the doctor went to the church to tell the priest about the vampires ravaging their town, but he didn't believe them and felt they were lying. As they were discussing, Mark burst into the church, and they were astonished on seeing him. He told them that Burke had now been transformed, and he is now one of them. Mark led the whole lot to the Marsten House, and they all went inside. They scanned the whole room and couldn't find Straker's body. All of a sudden, a door opened tight in front of them, and Ben checked it with a torchlight and discovered that there was no stairs. They eventually used a ladder to get down and was searching for the vampires. Then they started hearing a strange sound but couldn't ascertain where it was coming from. Burke then came out from the shadows and Ben stabbed him. Burke still caught up to Ben and was pulling him in. The priest then burst open the cellar door, making Burke to be set ablaze. Then Ben stabbed him through his heart this time. Meanwhile, after they got out, Mark told them that Barlow is coming for his parents tonight, so they have to devise a means to keep everyone safe. The priest suggested they all inform each of their family members to take shelter in the church so they can survive the night. Susan went straight home to warn her mother of the imminent danger about to befall the town, but a vampire came out of hiding and bit her. Ben then swiftly took her out of the house. Meanwhile, at Mark's home, the priest was trying to convince Mark's dad to follow them to the church, but he was unwilling to leave. Just then, they heard a creeping noise, and Mark's dad went to check it out. The priest's cross started glowing, and Barlow came from behind and fed on his mom. The priest tried to rebuke Barlow with his cross, but it wasn't working, and Mark's father burst inside bleeding. Mark ran outside, and then the priest's cross began to fade out, due to his lack of faith making Barlow have an opportunity to devour him. However, Mark ran into the woods and climbed his tree house, but he was already surrounded by vampires. Mark locked all the windows in the treehouse and sat there scared and his lonesome. Ben drove Susan to the church and brought her to the doctor so she can administer the rabies shot to her, but was already too late as she had started to transform. Susan burst out of the church, and Ben went after her, but she was already long gone. Ben was surrounded by a league of hungry vampires, so he ran back to the church, and they both got in and locked the doors. As they were inside, the vampires threw the sheriff's body inside. The next day, Ben and the doctor went to Mark's house, and they saw a note there that Mark left, saying he was going to kill Barlow. Mark infiltrated Straker's shop with a stick in his hand. Mark then tried to attack him, and he used the stick on him. Ben and the doctor traced Mark at Straker's shop and wanted to take him and run away, but he insisted that they fight back because Barlow killed his parents. The three of them went to the drive-in because they felt that that's where all the vampires took shelter. Ben then proceeded to open one of the trunks, and he saw Susan laying there. Then the doctor took the stake from Mark in a bid to kill her. Susan's mother then shot the doctor and kept on shooting, so Ben and Mark ran for their lives. Night approached, and all the vampires each opened their trunk and started coming out. They eventually surrounded Ben and almost bit him, but Mark made a smart move by driving past the board that was blocking the sunlight, and as it fell, all the vampire in its reach burned to death. Susan's mom kept on shooting at them. Then Mark used the same vehicle to ram her to the ground, and she died. They then sighted a coffin where they felt Barlow might be hiding, so Ben drew the coffin out of the truck and tried to open it, but it was too heavy. Night was slowly approaching them, and they ran out of time. Barlow burst open the coffin, so they ran into the barn nearby to take shelter. Susan attacked Ben inside the bar, but he pushed Mark outside so she couldn't reach him. Mark got up, and when he looked up, he saw Barlow standing on the top of a roof, so he ran. Susan almost killed Ben, but he tumbled her and eventually staked her. Mark was hiding in a garage. He then started turning on the lights of the cars there. Barlow started bursting in from above, and he finally caught Mark and wanted to feed on him, but Ben came to his rescue and staked him through his mouth and finally in his heart. Mark crawled out of the garage, and they both drove away. The movie then came to an end. Thanks for watching. Kindly subscribe if you enjoy recaps like this. Thanks for watching and goodbye.